August 8, 1943. 2,300 hours. Blackhead Strait, Solomon Islands. The sea was calm, but alive, black water reflecting starlight like scattered metal. 3 narrow hulls, wooden and fast, cut through the darkness at 40 knots. Their names were small and impersonal: PT 109, PT 162, PT 169. Engines low, men silent. The youngest aboard was 19, the oldest barely 30. Each knew that silence was survival. Ahead lay the Tokyo Express, Japanese destroyers running supplies to Kalimbangara under the cover of night. To meet them, these American boats carried nothing heavier than 4 torpedoes and .50 caliber guns. No automat, no radar worth trusting. Only speed, luck, and courage. A lookout whispered, "Contact, bearing green 10." Engines throttled up. The sea rose behind them in white spray. Torpedoes loosed. In the seconds before impact, the ocean seemed to hold its breath. Then, fire, thunder, and fragments of steel falling back into the dark. When the echoes faded, the destroyers turned their guns and found only emptiness. The Americans were gone, vanished into the night that had hidden them. It was the first time Japanese captains realized the Pacific now belonged to ghosts built of wood and will. October 1940. Bayonne, New Jersey. The sound of saws ripping through mahogany echoed across the Electric Launch Company shipyard. Heavy oak saw blades, rivet guns clattering, men hunched over designs on drafting tables. The U.S. Navy had issued a challenge: build a fast patrol torpedo boat capable of running corridors, ambushing supply convoys, and slipping away into darkness. The result, PT-1 through PT-9, 8 prototype boats, experimental designs laid down under Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 1, MT Buran 1. These early boats were tested, evaluated, and found wanting in speed, sea handling, and endurance. From those prototypes sprang the standard carriers of the PT fleet. 2 main types. The Elko boats, 80-foot wooden hulls built by Elko in Bayonne, New Jersey, and the slightly smaller Higgins 78-foot types, built in New Orleans. The Navy standardized on these designs as war loomed, and the need for fast attack craft grew urgent. Mid-1942, PT 109 was laid down March 4, 1942, at the Elko Works in Bayonne. Launched June 20th, delivered July 10th, and completed July 19th. This 80-foot Elko boat would become legendary under Light, J.G. John F. Kennedy. Armament: 4 21-inch torpedo tubes, .50 caliber machine guns in twin mounts, a 20mm cannon aft, small arms. Propulsion came from 3 Packard W14 petrol engines. Maximum speed officially recorded around 41 knots in trials. By late 1942, PT boat squadrons were being deployed in the Pacific. PT 109 joined Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 5 before being assigned to MT Buran 2 in the Solomons, Tulagi area, slave to the convoys of the Tokyo Express by night, executing small boat raids, reconnaissance, daring torpedo attacks under the cover of darkness. The boats were fragile. Wooden planking, limited armor, virtually none, cramped quarters, fuel carried in petrol tanks that could ignite at the slightest spark. But they had something else, something the Japanese did not expect: audacity. Operating mostly at night, evading radar, slipping close to enemy shipping lanes, then vanishing before depth charges or destroyer escorts could answer. These early missions proved critical. PT-37, for example, built by Elko and entering service in July 1941, took part in patrols off Guadalcanal and scored hits on enemy shipping. Actions that showed small, fast craft could harry a numerically superior foe. In those months of trial by fire, the doctrine was being written in salt, sweat, and broken torpedoes. Operators learned that speed could kill, but surprise killed more. Control of darkness, navigation through reefs, quiet engines, humidity-soaked decks, seasick crews. Each piece had to work or else risk total disaster. November 1942. Iron Bottom Sound, Guadalcanal. Night fell over Savo Island and the narrow channel the Americans called the Slot. In the dark, the Japanese ran a rhythm of steam and flash. Destroyers and fast transports steaming from Rabaul down the slot, unloading men and supplies on Guadalcanal and slipping north before sunrise. The Tokyo Express. For months, the Imperial Navy had used speed and discipline to keep the island's garrison fed. Overt interception by large Allied ships was costly. Into that calculus stepped the smallest warships the U.S. Navy could field, PT boats, wooden hulls that could cross the slot under cover of darkness, cut the enemy's supply lines, and vanish. The idea was simple. The execution was brutal. PT boats of motor torpedo boat squadrons, for example MT Buran II and MT Buran V, based around Guadalcanal, prowled the slot by night, their crews navigating by compass, stars, and the faint glow of distant shore lights. Crews learned to throttle engines to near idle to minimize phosphorescent wakes, to read the sea for wakes of big ships, and to approach under the moon's blind side. The typical armament in those months included up to 4 21-inch torpedoes, initially Mark 8s launched from Mark 18 style tubes, twin .50 caliber machine guns, and whatever light cannon the boats could carry. Yet PT doctrine had to contend with two ugly facts. Their torpedoes were heavy and awkward to launch, and Japanese destroyers carried the Type 93 Long Lance, torpedoes of terrifying range and punch. Against that combination, PT captains relied on surprise, close-in approach, and the fury of speed. The early nights off Guadalcanal were a school of hard lessons. In several nocturnal encounters in late 1942, PT squadrons pressed attacks on resupply runs and barges, sometimes scoring hits on shallow draft barges and merchant types, but almost never delivering crippling blows to destroyers. American torpedo technology and launching gear were imperfect in the first campaigns. The Mark 8 torpedoes and their heavy above-water tubes sometimes betrayed flash or mechanical failure when launched in close quarters. Field improvisation followed. Gunnery was beefed up, rockets and 20mm cannons were added for dealing with barges, and daring commanders experimented with tactics that exploited darkness rather than tried to match Japanese night fighting at its own game. Among the PT skippers who turned improvisation into legend was Lieutenant John D. Bulkeley, a hard, pragmatic leader whose MTB-3 boats operated in the Philippines and later in the Solomons. Bulkeley's evacuation of General Douglas MacArthur from Corregidor in March 1942 showcased PT boats as tools of audacity and stealth. The same skill set, night navigation, high-risk approaches, and nerve, would carry the PT force into the slot. Bulkeley earned a Medal of Honor and a public reputation that helped define the PT myth. Small boats, outsized results when handled by men willing to accept risk. The deadly irony of the Solomons was that success for PTs was measured differently than for larger ships. Sinking a destroyer in the slot was possible, but rare. More often, PTs forced the Japanese to alter schedules, slowed resupply runs, and destroyed light craft and barges that replenished the front. The psychological dimension was as important as the material. Japanese watch officers began to fear the slot after repeated raids. Watchful crews squinted into black water for any glint of an approaching wooden hull. Devils in the Dark was not pure propaganda. Night raids changed the tempo of resupply and forced higher risk and expense on every run. The strategic payoff, even modest interdiction, multiplied the cost of holding Guadalcanal. Not every story was a success. The most famous disaster came on August 2nd, 1943, when PT 109, commanded by Light J.G. John F. Kennedy, was struck by the Japanese destroyer Amidjiri in Blackhead Strait and cut in two. 2 crewmen were lost. The survivors swam to nearby islands, were tended and rescued. Kennedy's leadership during and after the wreck became an American legend and cemented the human mythology around PT service. Yet PT 109's fate also underscored the peril. At close quarters against fast, heavily armed destroyers, a wooden 80-foot boat had almost no margin for error. Tactical adaptation followed failure. By mid-1943, PT commands began to replace heavy Mark 8 torpedoes and the cumbersome above-deck launch tubes with lighter roll-off racks carrying Mark 13 torpedoes. The Mark 13 had been developed as an aerial torpedo but adapted to PT use, slimming launch signature and improving handling. Crews also learned to fight with guns and rockets when engaging barges and unarmored ships. The boat's speed and maneuverability made them exceptional close-in gun platforms after torpedo effectiveness proved inconsistent. PT doctrine shifted toward multi-role harassment, torpedo attacks against capital ships when opportunity allowed, gun and rocket attacks against supply lines and shore installations, and rescue and reconnaissance missions as needed. The human dimension remained constant. PT crews operated in cramped, hot, and often wet conditions, living with the constant risk of fire or catastrophic magazine explosion if fuel or torpedoes were hit. Yet those sailors, many barely adults and many reservists and volunteers, developed a distinct culture, tight crews, aggressive captains, and a willingness to accept missions larger than the boats themselves. The PT's contribution to the Solomons was not grand gestures alone. It was attrition, harassment, and a creeping attritional effect that compounded the logistical difficulties of holding distant islands. As Allied material and air superiority slowly tightened the noose around Japanese supply lines, the PTs carved out a niche, small, fast, and deadly when used properly. By the close of 1943, the doctrine had evolved again. Elko and Higgins boats, improved armament, better torpedo racks, and more experienced crews made PT squadrons more dangerous and more flexible. Their limits remained. They were not substitute destroyers. But the Pacific had changed. A theater once dominated by large surface actions now featured nights of wooden ghosts striking in narrow channels, forcing the Japanese to pay with speed, fuel, and increased escort. The slot had become a proving ground where courage met adaptation, and where the tiniest vessels could, at the right moment, shape strategy. Late 1942, early 1943. Solomon Islands and Iron Bottom Sound. Darkness was both a shield and a battlefield. PT boat skippers learned that the cover of night did more than conceal. They let wood and leather become weapons. But to use the night, they needed tools, technique, and nerves flayed by fear and salt spray. Initially, PTs had no radar. Visual cues, searchlights, stars, flickers were all the crews had. But in the Philippines, under extremists like John Bulkeley, the need for night vision tools became urgent. Bulkeley lobbied for aircraft radar sets, about 12, retrofit to PTs in his Squadron 7 in early 1943. These sets derived from aircraft radar gear often had frequent failures, faulty power supplies, unreliable range, but proved crucial for detecting large targets in darkness. By mid-1943, more PTs carried dedicated radar. SO-type radars, surface search, and later the SO-3, with domes mounted atop masts to get better horizon sweep. Boats like PT-305, a Higgins 78-foot boat, used radar in conjunction with guns, rockets, and torpedoes, especially on moonless nights. Without reliable radar in 1942, PT boats developed navigation by moonlight, stars, compass bearings, and radio silence. Crews learned to read currents, avoid reefs sharply by sound, and throttle engines to near idle to hide phosphorescent wakes. Any flash from a torpedo tube, especially the above-deck Mark 8 or early Mark 13 types, could give away position. Crews modified procedures. Launching from roll-off racks became more controlled, grease-wiped, barrel vents shielded where possible. When accompanied by aircraft or shore stations, flare drops or illumination could betray PT positions. Japanese patrols used flares, searchlights, and float planes to spot wakes or silhouettes. PTs responded with smoke generators, stern-mounted, dive curves, and zigzagging retreats after attack runs. Night of 1 to 2 August 1943, Blackhead Strait stands out. PT boats from Rendova, about 15 boats, split into 4 divisions, took up stations. Puto osuta chinzechi no, puto osuta chinzechi shapte, puto osuta shaizechi doi, puto osuta no, They awaited the Tokyo Express destroyers. Visibility was poor. Despite dozens of torpedoes launched, very few hits were scored. PT-109 was rammed by the Japanese destroyer Amajurai, severed and sunk in part. John F. Kennedy's command after the collision became legendary. Another action, PT-134, Ensign Edmund F. Wackelin, and PT-189, Light J.G. Joseph J. Fitzpatrick, attacked barges east of a beach named Somme. Aircraft, a Beaufort, dropped flares. PTs approached unseen, sank several barges using guns and rockets, using flares as guides, then withdrew under cover. Torpedoes. Mark 8s were heavy, often launched from fixed tubes prone to flash and mechanical failure. Mark 13 torpedoes, lighter, roll-off type, later became standard. Many attacks failed simply because torpedoes did not arm due to range being too short or depth settings incorrect. Radar unreliability remained. Early radar sets suffered from power issues. Boats often had no radar at all, depending on assignment. Night visibility, moon phase, weather, and sea conditions affected outcomes heavily. In moonless or overcast nights, detection came nearly by touch and sound. Maintenance was a constant battle. Wooden hulls, saltwater damage, wear on engines. After long night missions, PTs returned to forward bases often in poor shape. Crews labored through exhaustion, refueling, often with 55-gallon drums, reloading torpedoes, repairing engines under dim oil lamps. Sometimes boats limped in, missing parts, leaking fuel. Underneath every tactical adjustment lay sailors fighting their own fears. The darkness amplified every creak in the hull, every splash behind the boat, every distant star like a judge. But there was exhilaration in each launch. The thrum, the torque, screaming seas. Commanders became artists of stealth. When to throttle, when to gun the engines, when to attack from portside shadows or use the moon-blinded horizon. Crews shared stories of torpedoes that glinted like glass through the sea, of destroyers' searchlights swinging past with no one at gun mounts, of escape through islands' reefs. These stories mattered. They built confidence, and confidence in the PTs meant that each night's mission, no matter how small, added to a cumulative pressure on Japanese supply lines that grew impossible to sustain. September 1943, New Georgia, Solomon Islands. The sea no longer belonged solely to Japan at night. The once silent lanes of the slot now hissed with the passage of American PT boats. Imperial Navy officers began referring to them in radio codes as Makuzo no Oni, wooden devils. Yet the Japanese did not yield the dark easily. They adapted, turning the Solomon Islands into a test range for new countertactics. The Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN, possessed an advantage that no wooden craft could ignore: superb night optics. Type 96 150-centimeter searchlights and Type 22 surface search radar on destroyers, such as Shigure and Amajurai, gave the Japanese early warning once PT boats closed within 5,000 yards. Lookouts trained at the Yokosuka Gunnery School could detect faint phosphorescent wakes long before radar picked them up. After the loss of several supply barges in the Central Solomons in mid-1943, destroyer escorts were ordered to run at 30 knots with alternating zigzags, searchlights sweeping in coordinated arcs, a deadly web that could blind or silhouette approaching PTs. PT boats countered with smoke generators and blackout paint, dulling any reflection from their hulls. Elco crews in the Tulagi base even applied mixtures of soot and oil to remove the faint sheen of varnish that betrayed them under moonlight. It was an escalating duel between light and invisibility. By late 1943, Tokyo Express destroyers faced unsustainable losses from air power and submarines, so the IJN shifted much of its night resupply to steel-hulled Daihatsu landing barges and subchaser-escorted convoys. The barges, moving barely 8 knots, hugged reefs and coastlines, too shallow for big ships, perfect targets for PTs. The Japanese responded with ingenuity. mounted 13.2 mm Type 93 machine guns on barges for low-angle fire. Installed shielded 37 mm cannons scavenged from aircraft. Deployed Army field guns on nearby beaches to cover unloading points. These small defenses turned many PT ambushes into slugging matches fought at pistol range. An engagement on October 13, 1943, near Choiseul saw PT 64 and PT 68 under light J.G. Robert Owens attack a convoy of 5 barges escorted by armed subchasers. Owens' torpedo scored a direct hit on one barge loaded with ammunition. The resulting explosion lit the bay for miles, revealing the American boats. Japanese gunners opened with tracers. PT-68 was holed twice, but escaped behind its own smokescreen. The Japanese soon realized that PTs navigated mainly by radio silence and visual bearings. Counterintelligence units began transmitting false radio bearings on American frequencies to lure PT patrols off course. U.S. commanders quickly restricted transmissions to coded brevity signals and trained navigators to distrust any compass swing near iron or islands that distorted magnetic readings. By early 1944, Japanese radar technology, specifically Type 22 and Type 13 air warning sets, had proliferated. However, most destroyers lacked the crew discipline to exploit radar tactically. Watch officers still trusted their eyes. The Americans exploited this conservatism. PT flotillas would bait Japanese destroyers with radar pips, then lead them toward reef-lined shallows where aircraft or shore batteries could strike. The night of 6 to 7 October 1943 became emblematic of the duel's intensity. During the Japanese evacuation of Vella La Vella, 11 destroyers under Rear Admiral Matsuji Ijuin attempted to rescue 600 troops. PT-134, PT-126, and PT-130 of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 9 intercepted near Marcana Bay. Radar contact was fleeting. Moonlight betrayed silhouettes. PT-134 fired 2 Mark 13 torpedoes. Explosions followed, striking the destroyer Shigur's port quarter, though damage was limited. Minutes later, Japanese returned fire. 127 mm shells and machine gun bursts forced the PTs to scatter. While the battle's strategic outcome favored Japan, most troops were evacuated. The psychological blow was real. Even in retreat, the Empire could no longer move without harassment. Facing heavy resistance, U.S. squadrons evolved again. Upgunning. 37 mm and 40 mm Bofors cannons replaced 20 mm Oerlikons aft. Rocket launchers. 4.5-inch spin-stabilized rockets gave standoff punch against barges. Radar coordination. PTs began receiving vectoring from shore radar stations on Rendova and Treasury Islands, integrating with Army and Marine air patrols. By 1944, these innovations turned PT boats into multi-role craft, scouts, interdiction raiders, and rescue ships. They evacuated downed pilots, guided landing craft through reefs, and conducted deception operations. The Japanese, forced to divert destroyers as convoy escorts, weakened their frontline battle groups, just as Allied offensives expanded toward the Marshalls and the Philippines. To the Japanese, PTs represented unpredictability. Reports from survivors described a flash, a roar, and fire on the sea. Bargemen and destroyer captains alike dreaded the sudden convergence of white wakes in black water. Each raid forced more complex scheduling, consuming precious fuel oil. The Tokyo Express, that once roared nightly, was reduced to a trickle of barge convoys crawling along the coast under the shadow of air attack. For American sailors, the fight forged an identity: the Mosquito Fleet. Bay signs at Tulagi and Rendova read, "They bite by night." Crews personalized boats with shark mouths and pin-up art, carrying names like Thunderbolt, Devil Dog, and Bite 'em Back. Despite heavy attrition, over 70 PTs lost in the Solomons campaign alone, the legend grew larger than numbers. Japanese countermeasures did exact a toll. Shellfire and air raids destroyed numerous PTs and forward bases. PT-117 and 164 were lost during a bombing of Rendova Harbor on August 1st, 1943. PT-109's tragedy illustrated how one misjudged moment could doom a crew. Yet these losses never broke the fleet's morale. In pure tonnage destroyed, PTs sank modest amounts, around 200,000 tons of enemy shipping by war's end, but their strategic influence far exceeded the metric. Every destroyer diverted to escort duty, every barge delayed, hastened Japan's logistical exhaustion. By the beginning of 1944, the Imperial Navy conceded the Solomons and retreated toward Rabaul and Truk. PT boats followed like wolves, establishing new bases at Treasury Islands and later in the Philippines. The duel that began in the slot now stretched across 1,000 miles of Pacific darkness. Japan's once dominant night fleets had been forced into daylight defense. The legacy was paradoxical. Japan's mastery of night fighting had birthed its nemesis. American sailors learned those same arts, refined them with radar, and returned them amplified. From that crucible came the doctrine that defined the remainder of the Pacific War: control the night, and you control the sea. October 1944, Leyte Gulf, Philippines. The sea boiled with the largest naval battle in history. Carrier decks burned, cruisers collided, and somewhere in the chaos, a wooden silhouette skimmed through the spray. PT-493, part of motor torpedo boat Squadron 33, throttled to 40 knots toward the island of Samar. Her Packard engines shrieked as the Mosquito fleet returned to the waters where its legend had begun. General Douglas MacArthur's October 1944 landing on Leyte wasn't merely symbolic. It was logistical ballet. Between invasion beaches, offshore reefs, and narrow channels, heavy destroyers couldn't maneuver. That left PT boats to perform the invisible labor of war: reconnaissance, channel marking, smoke screening, and night interdiction. Under Lieutenant Commander Robert J. Bulkley, Jr., the boats of MT-Rons 31, 33, and 36 operated from advanced bases at Leyte Gulf, Ormoc Bay, and Mindoro. They scouted every inlet, mapped shoals, and provided real-time reports to 7th Fleet. Within weeks, PTs were dueling again with Japan's newest threat: suicide craft and air-launched Shinyo boats would in lethal collisions at midnight. Many of these small kamikaze craft carried 250 kilograms warheads and traveled nearly 30 knots. PT crews learned to open fire the moment phosphorescence betrayed a wake. By the end of 1944, PTs had destroyed more than 300 enemy barges and suicide boats in the Philippines archipelago. Experience from the Solomons paid off. By this stage, nearly all frontline PTs carried SO-3 surface search radar, feeding data to shore-based fighter direction centers. At Ormoc Bay, PT-490 and PT-491, commanded by Lieutenant John D. Bulkley, yes, the same Medal of Honor hero of the Philippines' 1942 evacuation, guided destroyers of Task Group 77.3 toward Japanese transports slipping through night squalls. When radar pips merged, Bulkley's boats closed to within 1,000 yards and launched Mark 13 torpedoes from roll-off racks. 2 direct hits sank the transport T-9 on November 28, 1944. Radar made PTs true hunters, not just ambushers. For the first time, they could stalk enemy barges in darkness without moonlight. Crewmen described the eerie glow of cathode screens in cockpits, the green arc sweeping every few seconds, each blip a heartbeat of distant steel. If Guadalcanal had been their classroom, Ormoc Bay was their graduation. From 3 to December 15, 1944, Japan funneled convoys of TA-designated transports down the Camotes Sea to reinforce Leyte. PTs of Squadron 33 met them nightly. On December 3rd, PT-490, 491, and 492 detected 3 transports under destroyer escort take and Kawa. In a high-speed melee of guns and phosphorescence, Kawa was struck by torpedoes and later sunk by destroyer Allen Sumner. PT boat's radar contact had set up the ambush. 2 nights later, PT 144 and PT 323 from Squadron 37 harried barges until dawn, claiming 5 sunk with 40 mm fire. Yet success came at cost. Air raids from Takao-based aircraft shredded the PT anchorages at Albura and Base 17. PT 495 was lost to strafing. PT 490 badly holed by near-miss bombs. Men lived under constant attack, sleeping in engine rooms or under overturned hulls pulled ashore for cover. Resource scarcity forced invention. Mechanics converted .50 caliber twin mounts into quad setups, salvaged Bofors 40 mm guns from wrecked landing craft, and attached rocket racks along the gunnels. Fuel shortages meant crews siphoned aviation gasoline from abandoned drums. Sometimes engines ran on mixtures far above octane rating. Explosive but effective. Bulkley's maintenance crews developed the PT kit, portable repair gear with spare spark plugs, gaskets, and Packard engine parts stored in waterproof cases. A PT could now be patched at sea or in jungle coves without a tender. That mobility let squadrons leapfrog with MacArthur's island-hopping campaign from Leyte to Mindoro to Luzon. In December 1944, PT boats screened convoys for the Mindoro invasion. When Caton human torpedoes and explosive motorboats attacked, PTs fought almost point-blank. On December 15th, PT 222 and PT 223 destroyed 4 suicide craft off Ambulong Island. Explosions tossed planks sky-high, showering burning gasoline over crews. Sailors beat out fires with wet rags and continued firing. Despite the chaos, the landing succeeded. PTs had intercepted most attackers before they reached transports. Attrition gnawed at the squadrons. PT 300 was lost in a collision during heavy rain off Mindoro. PT 331 and PT 332 hit mines near Ormoc. Over 30 PT boats were destroyed in Philippine operations, but replacements flowed from the States. The Elko 80-footers and Higgins 78-footers that had once trickled out of New Jersey and New Orleans now arrived by the dozen. Each loss was felt intimately. 40 men per squadron meant every absence had a name, a bunk, a voice missing from the night. By spring 1945, the pattern repeated. Radar contact, sprint, torpedo splash, and retreat. At Bataan and Corregidor, PTs closed a circle begun 3 years earlier when Bulkeley evacuated MacArthur under Japanese fire. Now, they escorted the general's returning convoys through the same waters. In Manila Bay, PT 373 and PT 374 cut down retreating barges near Cavite. Elsewhere, PT 523 rescued 180 Filipino civilians trapped between battle lines, proving their versatility extended beyond destruction. When the Philippines campaign closed in July 1945, PTs had sunk or destroyed 600 enemy craft, barges, small transports, suicide boats, provided over 700 shore bombardments with rockets and 40 mm cannon, conducted 150 rescue missions for downed aviators and stranded soldiers. They had become a vital arm of combined operations, a far cry from the experimental prototypes of 1940. The wooden hulls that once seemed fragile had outlived many steel warships. They prowled the waters of Mindoro, Lingayen, and Subic Bay until the day the Emperor's voice fell silent. On September 2nd, 1945, when Japan formally surrendered, several PTs lay moored in Manila Bay, deck-scarred, engines still ticking as if unwilling to rest. Crewmen stood in sweat-stained khakis and watched fireworks of tracer fire fade into the tropical night. They had fought in darkness and heat, with fuel fumes in their lungs and salt crusting every wound. Yet they had returned to the islands and won. August 1945. Tokyo lay silent beneath drifting smoke. In Manila Bay, the PT boats of Squadrons 33 and 36 floated at anchor, scarred, fuel-starved, and coated in salt that glittered under the Pacific sun. The radio crackled with the words they had dreamed of since the first torpedo struck at Balikpapan. Japan has surrendered unconditionally. No cheers erupted. Men simply stared across the calm water. For 3 years, they had lived at 40 knots, hunted in darkness, struck from the shadows, and vanished again into the waves. Now, the sea itself seemed too still. Demobilization came swiftly. The U.S. Navy no longer needed hundreds of wooden torpedo boats. By October 1945, orders arrived. Dispose of craft not required for peacetime service. Across the Philippines, Guam, and Okinawa, PT crews stood on beaches as bulldozers shoved their boats, once instruments of daring, into shallow graves of sand and fire. At Samar, sailors of Squadron 31 wept as PT 379, PT 380, and PT 381 were burned to prevent Japanese remnants from scavenging their parts. The flames painted the night red, the same color as tracer rounds that had once streaked over Surigao Strait. Only a few survived. PT 617, PT 796, and PT 658 would eventually be preserved in museums decades later, silent witnesses to the twilight of the wooden fleet. For many PT sailors, the transition home was harder than any battle. They were men in their early 20s who had commanded lethal machines under fire. Now they returned to gas stations, classrooms, and factory floors. Lieutenant John D. Bulkeley, Medal of Honor recipient, remained in the Navy and rose to Vice Admiral, commanding destroyers in Korea and Vietnam. Others, like Lieutenant J.G. John F. Kennedy, skipper of PT 109, carried their lessons into politics. Kennedy's wartime experience, his rescue of survivors after his boat was rammed by the Japanese destroyer Amagirai in 1943, became part of a national mythology of courage and endurance. When Kennedy stood before the nation in 1961 and said, "We stand on the edge of a new frontier," those words echoed with the restless spirit of the men who had once patrolled the dark seas in fragile craft of mahogany and aluminum. Though their hulls burned, the PTs left behind a blueprint for the future of naval warfare. Their tactics, hit-and-run strikes, coastal interdiction, radar-guided ambushes, and fast insertion operations became the foundation for the Navy's post-war patrol craft, FAST, and later, special boat units used by the Navy SEALs. The lessons learned in the Philippines and the Solomons lived on in Cold War strategies. When aluminum-hulled PBRs, patrol boat, river, cut through the brown waters of the Mekong Delta 2 decades later, their DNA traced back to the Elko 80-footer that once slipped through the black waves of the Pacific. By the time the last squadron disbanded in late 1945, the Mosquito fleet had suffered over 70 boats lost in combat and hundreds of men killed or wounded. The ocean swallowed them without headlines, without grand monuments. Their enemies rarely saw them. Only the phosphorescent wake of their passage, the sudden flash of torpedoes, and then the dark again. They were ghosts of the Pacific, and when peace came, they faded as quietly as they had fought. Yet among the veterans, the bond never broke. At reunions in the 1950s and 1960s, gray-haired men gathered around model PT boats, tracing the shapes of torpedo racks and gun mounts with trembling fingers. They spoke of nights near New Georgia, of rain that felt like steel needles, of the smell of gasoline and cordite mixed with salt. And they always ended their stories the same way. She was just wood, but she never failed us. Today, the survivors stand silent in museums. PT 617, preserved at Battleship Cove in Massachusetts, gleams under spotlights, her Packard engines restored to their original thunder. Visitors walk her deck and read names etched in brass, men who never came home. In Portland, Oregon, PT 658 still runs, its engines alive with the roar of history. Volunteers keep her seaworthy, a living artifact of a time when courage weighed less than 10 tons and floated on planks of mahogany. Every bolt, every burn mark is a reminder that victory in the Pacific was not won by steel alone, but by men who fought with what they had, where they were, and never stopped. In 1946, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz wrote, "Among the many heroes of this war, the crews of our small combatant craft stand in the front rank of valor." He was right. The PT boats represented something purer than might or metal, the unbreakable faith that speed, daring, and ingenuity could defy empire. Their war was fought in inches, in seconds, in shadows, and yet it shaped the course of the Pacific. As the world moved on, the veterans carried their memories quietly. Many never spoke of the fear, the noise, the smell of burning fuel. But when asked what they missed most, they would simply say, the sea and the boys. The wooden hulls are gone. The men who served aboard them are nearly all at rest. But their story still cuts through time like a torpedo wake on a moonless sea. Every generation faces its own storm. And the lesson of the PT boats is not about machines, but about resolve. They remind us that courage is built, not born, that innovation thrives in desperation, and that even the smallest craft can change the tide of war when steered by steady hands and fearless hearts. So when you see the calm surface of the ocean, remember what once hid beneath it. Men who fought in silence, who risked everything on decks of wood, who turned darkness into their weapon. Their story is not finished. It lives wherever we choose to honor it. In classrooms, in documentaries, in the whispered pride of families who still remember. Because history fades only when we stop telling it. And as long as their wake ripples across the sea of memory, the PT boats of World War II will never vanish into the night.